So as you see, it is just like a couple of 4 years without having enough rainfall. It's now a national disaster. You see, even the mamas here and the children, the children depend on the milks, and we have nowhere to get those milk. We used to sell those cows in order to get money. We have nothing to take to the market in order to get the bread on the table.
This one is going to die just the next day. I think it is going to cause also some more conflict, because if people lack food, what are they going to eat? And they might resolve to conflict. Also, they might also move to other places to go and look for food. And if they do not get, then they will take it with their arms or with their violently.
Thanks so much, Chris, for joining us here in Olepolos, just south of Nairobi, where we can see it's pretty dry conditions and it hasn't rained in a while. But Chris, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, what your role is at the United Nations?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me here. But so my name's Chris Hodder, and I am the Climate Security Environmental Advisor for the UN in Somalia. So I'm the first climate security advisor to a special political mission, and my role is really to try to understand those linkages between climate change and what's happening in the environment, and how that links to the instability and some of the insecurity that we're seeing in Somalia.
Great. I mean, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the work that you're doing, but I thought maybe we could start off by trying to explain the links between climate and conflict, and those indirect pathways that we know a lot about, but perhaps our audience would like to know more about. What are those indirect pathways that you see in the kind of work that you do?
So at no time do we ever say that there's a direct link between climate and insecurity and conflict. But what we can see, there are, as you said, there are these indirect links. And so what we're seeing is that there are about 4 of these indirect links that we're trying to sort of tease out and work through. And so the first one is really around livelihoods. And actually what we see is that as climate change exacerbates the cycle of droughts and floodings and climatic events, what we see is that there becomes more and more of a competition over livelihoods. And these livelihoods are really around water and around grazing lands. And so as we see drought conditions worsen, as we're seeing in the Horn of Africa and here, we're seeing that access to water and availability of water is decreasing. And so that means that people come into competition over trying to get that water. And it's the same with grazing lands. When we have cattle or goats or camels coming to graze, they often come into competition over the land that's left because there's just no grass available. So, and as we think about climate change, that is going to get more and more complex and more competition. The second pathway is around displacement and movement of populations. And what we can see is actually, as climate change gets more and more evident, and we can see it happening more and more, we're seeing that populations move or have to move. And again, it's no way we're directly saying that climate change is causing displacement, because displacement is multi-complex. People move because of conflict, but they also move because of climatic events. So say there is a big flood, or like the drought now, more and more people are moving to places where they can actually access water or land or jobs or different livelihoods. And so, but that displacement means that people move onto land that can be owned or work in other areas by other clans, and that can then cause competition and conflict as well. The third pathway is one around armed actors, an armed group. And what we're seeing is actually armed actors such as Al-Shabaab are actually using or benefiting from parts of the climatic changes to provide environmental justice and working on providing swift solutions for communities that don't have governmental or other systems that can help with their sort of their issues and the problems they're facing. And so, but we're also seeing that other militant groups are also gaining from taxation, so the movement of natural resources like charcoal, like sugar, like the cat trade. They're actually gaining quite a lot in terms of the finance from that. And finally, what we're also seeing is that militant groups are using the lack of the control over natural resources like water and grazing lands to be able to control and work through the communities. And the last one is really around elite capture and how sometimes elites in different countries can control and work on some of the finances as well as some of the political control, which means that a lot of the resources and control and processes don't go down to the community level. So yes, I mean it's complex, but there are the indirect links we're seeing.
Really interesting just to pick up on two of those kind of indirect pathways, particularly the last one on political elites. And we've seen that in South Sudan, for example, where we have the militarization of cattle raids and certain political actors using cattle raiding and arming cattle raiders in particular to carry out these kinds of armed banditry that we see in South Sudan, and sort of capturing resources like water and pasture, and also on the strategic risk where we see Al-Shabaab not only using climate change and drought and flooding to benefit it, but also Al-Shabaab is impacted by climate change too, of course. And our research at Crisis Group has shown that more recently, I think in September, Al-Shabaab imposed about a 10% tax even on its own fighters, it says, to help in the drought relief effort. So you can see that these non-state armed actors are also being impacted by these dry conditions, by flooding also in parts of Somalia. But just to go back to your work on Somalia, what kind of challenges are you facing right now? Because obviously we have a huge drought and we have millions of people who are being impacted by food insecurity, but more than 1 million people who've been displaced as well by conflict and by the drought-like conditions. So how does that impact on the work that you're trying to achieve on the ground?
There are a lot of challenges, obviously, and this is quite a nascent area, but I think some of the biggest challenges is exactly that because there's so much need and humanitarian need at the moment, that the response and the way the international community and the government is working is very much in a short-term way, so very much focused on life-saving humanitarian support, which is totally important, and it has to happen.
And there needs to be a scaling up of that
and
even now.
Exactly,
yeah.
And I think that as you say, we need much more focus on that. But I think that focus on the short term takes away slightly some of the approach that we need to understand that as climate change gets more and more evident, and as it gets more and more worse, in terms of the drier conditions we're going to see reduced water levels, groundwater levels. We're going to see much more this unpredictability of flooding and drought cycles. We're going to see a much more of sea level rises and things like that. So those sort of projections show that actually climate change is going to exacerbate this situation. But if we focus on the short term and only on saving lives now, which we do need to do as well, we are not thinking about some of the longer term or medium term interventions. So that it's multifaceted, but really the challenge is how do we get slightly out of this only focus on the short term, and how can we do short term and medium and long term at the same time? So that's the sort of main challenge. But the second challenge is really around how do we bring in adaptation financing, climate financing, that allows for communities to build that resilience against these future climate shocks at the same time as looking at peace and stability. And that's really what climate peace and security really is about how do we at that local level build that resilience to the climatic shocks in the future, as well as building the peace and the stability at the same time. But I mean, I'm sure you must see this in other countries as well.
Yeah, so we've done quite a lot of research here in Kenya, actually, in the Great Rift Valley. We focused in on 2 counties, Laikipia and Baringo. And the reason why we focused on those particular counties was because, we have seen resource-based conflict, particularly in Laikipia, where it's a bit greener, it's a bit more lush, than its surrounding counties. So when there is a drought, and this drought is sort of unprecedented in its longevity, we've had already 4 failed rainy seasons, and we're looking at the moment at a potential 5th below average rainy season. So when there is drought, a lot of the herding communities that surround Laikipia tend to move to Laikipia, to the Mount Kenya area, where they believe there's more water, but even Laikipia has been affected by the drought as well. And really what we saw there was very complex. I mean, the roots of conflict there are complex and multifaceted, and they relate to many factors, which include historical grievances over land that date back to colonial times. They refer to, the marginalization of many communities there, poverty, rural poverty amongst the herding communities. There's a lack of infrastructure, schools, education, many things. And also there's been a kind of criminalization of the cattle trade. So you have criminal cartels where perhaps some political elites are involved, and we spoke about that in the case of South Sudan, but we also see that there as well, and particularly during election periods, and we just had an election in Kenya in August, you have this sort of uptick in violence because some political entities use land invasions or droughts or these kinds of issues and pressures to galvanize certain populations and to garner votes if they can. But definitely what we did see was that the drought is exacerbating a lot of these pre-existing conditions and tensions. And basically we've seen, more organized violence. We've seen illicit weapons coming in and being used, more armed banditry, and it is really concerning for people who are living in those county border regions what is happening. And we've seen a strong security force response from the Kenyan government, but at the same time we need a longer term vision for those regions. We need the short term relief that we just spoke about in Somalia, because a lot of the conditions that we're seeing in northern and northeastern Kenya are also in Somalia. But we need to be talking about climate adaptation. We need more investment in early warning as well. And we need that early warning to trickle down to communities so they're very aware of what's coming up in terms of climate issues, but also conflict as well. And you're working a lot on environmental degradation as well, and it's a huge factor in Kenya where we have rangelands that need to be managed, but they also need to be rehabilitated because they've been degraded so badly by deforestation and by soil erosion and the drought. And then you have erratic rainfall, which just washes away that topsoil, and it's a similar problem in Somalia as well. I mean, just talk us a little bit through the environmental impacts that you're seeing in Somalia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's this sort of very dangerous cycle of, warming and increases in heat that leads to soil erosion, right? And so as the soil gets drier, the water and the nutrients from the water hits and it will run off. But actually what we're seeing also, I mean, this is happening everywhere really in the Horn and in parts of Africa, is that also human, as human activity happens, so humans, if they're displacing, they often have to cut down trees for charcoal for a daily energy needs. So 90% of Somalis use charcoal as their daily energy needs. So as
they use it for cooking,
and warming
themselves.
Themselves. So and as populations move, they have to cut down trees, and so that displacement is causing maladaptation. Because I think a lot of communities traditionally, the pastoralists and the movement would know not to cut too many acacias down. There would be a management of the ecosystem, and that symbiotic relationship between the pastoralist and the environment was definitely there. And the rangeland management systems in northern Kenya and Somalia before the Barre regime or during the Barre regime was second to none. It was one of the most advanced systems of rangeland management, where pastoralists would know, and herders would know, to move from one area to another to allow for the ecosystems to
And that's a way to
regenerate.
adapt as
yes,
well,
and it's
right?
a way to adapt.
Because mobility is an adaptation tool.
Yes, exactly. And so as conflict and instability, but also as climate change happens, and as people displace because of these climate and conflict links, we're seeing that maladaptation is happening more and more. So people are cutting down trees in areas that maybe they're not aware of the ecosystems and the regenerations. And also what we're seeing is actually that rangeland management and that ecosystem thing is being lost in the younger generations as more and more young people are brought up in displaced areas or in urban environments. And so actually that symbiotic relationship is actually being lost. So actually what we're seeing is that increases the speed of the environmental degradation. And so what we're trying to see is that how can we help communities to adapt to these new changes, but also look at alternatives to charcoal, looking at how can we try to bring back some of the elder generations to try to bring more of that knowledge change and understanding.
I mean, a lot of people do say that when there are really difficult climate conditions, often you see people cooperating over natural resources rather than being in competition. But I guess in the cases that we're looking at in parts of Somalia and in parts of the Great Rift Valley in northern Kenya, the question is, obviously I think most people would prefer to choose cooperation over competition, but the question is, do they have the capacity to be able to do that? Do they have, the mediation means? Do they have the capacity to be able to share these resources or the scarce of resources that they have? And is it even possible when you see a situation where you have, 4 or even 5 failed rains and those resources are becoming scarcer and scarcer? What kinds of programming is the UN involved in to try to sort of mitigate some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the types of program that we're really trying to look at is this bringing together, and this goes back to that point we're trying to make, where you try to do short, medium, longer term interventions. So how can we infuse some environmental approaches to humanitarian response? So, like for example, if you dig a well, you just dig a well, and often it's like concrete associated, and actually the life cycle of that well is relatively short, and as climate change gets more and more visible, the water levels are going to drop, and actually a lot of wells fail relatively quickly. So what we're trying to figure out is, can we do digging water wells that work on the catchment area of where the rain would fall, and reinvigorating the areas with much more can we plant the right type of trees and shrubs around that water well that allows for the catchment to be much better and actually has the ability to saturate the water much better. And I think traditionally development agencies have been thinking much more in this sort of concrete based approach, like bank stabilization by putting a whole bank of concrete, and actually that concrete peels off very quickly and goes into the river. There's other interventions that I've seen before as well, and so really changing the interventions from a sort of concrete to much more nature-based and ecosystems thinking. So that's what we're trying to do in both the humanitarian and the development, but also now more on the stabilization side. How can peace actors, stabilization and security actors, really look at securing some of these areas like water wells, the forests and the riverbanks as part of the stabilization strategy.
But I guess that's going to be pretty difficult when you have the ongoing offensive in Somalia, which is creating problems, I guess, for the humanitarian aid and access, and also you have ongoing clan-based conflict. And when we're talking about climate financing for adaptation, Somalia is really at the bottom of the pile, unfortunately. I guess this is because of the security situation in the country, and also I guess politics does come into it, and political stabilization, and a strong central government that can basically persuade private and public funding that it's able to carry out these projects and able to stabilize parts of the country. I mean, What do you think should be done for Somalia to try to attract more of the financing that it needs to carry out these really fascinating and interesting projects?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts are from a regional perspective, but I think what Somalia needs to do is really around how, you know, they're on the right track, they're doing a great job, they've set up a new Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, and so that ministry is now, you know, really being strengthened. They've got a lot of support from the President and the Office of the Prime Minister, and there's a lot of right movement, but what the issue is, as you said, they've received very, very small amounts of funding, and partly it's because of the, you know, the historical governance issues. But now, with the governance getting strengthened, I think that there's opportunities for more and more climate financing to come in.
COP27, I guess, was disappointing for many developing countries because they were really hoping for more clarity on adaptation financing. But at the same time, this loss and damage fund, which communities have been calling for and states have been calling for 30 years, has finally been set up. But again, we have to wait and see whether, you know, who's going to be financing it, who's going to be putting money into this pot, how is it going to work, what are the mechanisms, who's going to be compensated for what. So still a lot of unanswered questions. So I guess, you know, we have to wait for COP28 in the United Arab Emirates to perhaps get some more answers to those questions. But going back to the question of climate financing in conflict-prone regions, I mean, what our research has shown is that I think the countries where there is conflict receive about 1/3 of the climate financing of countries that are at peace. But those countries that have conflict and climate issues need that money even more. And some would argue, I think you've argued this, that it's actually a key part of the process of stabilisation and peace, and adaptation should be part of that process, right?
Yes, absolutely, because I think traditionally, you know, stabilisation and security approaches, you know, work very well for that immediate response, but actually what we see is that, you know, the resilience to climate changes and climate you know, climate conflict risks it increases after stabilisation. So what we really need is some sort of contiguous flow from the sort of trying to look at some of the causes of the conflict, which do have environmental undercurrents to it. Well, it has a lot of that, but actually then how do we help communities get out of that competition over resources and the environmental degradation and the movement and that you know, lack of livelihoods, to be able to adapt to the changes in the environment. And that's exactly where climate financing really should be driving, to helping continue with that peace, but also help communities to adapt to those climatic changes.
And also trying to get the peace and security question into these discussions, thread them through. I think we saw that more at COP27, and we're hoping for that to continue and perhaps expand into COP28.
Yeah, so it's our hope that COP28 and the overture so far from the United Arab Emirates is that this discussion around climate security will play a larger role. So COP27 was the first COP that actually mentioned and started talking at these interlinkages between climate, peace and security, and we hope that the Abu Dhabi or the UAE discussions will have much more of this climate security angle, and really, as you said, how do we infuse the adaptation language with this peace and security part, but also how do we infuse the peace and security debate with this adaptation side? So it's really bringing those two together. But yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you as well to hear about all your work as well.
Thank you.